Läuft.
Okay.
Hey, Charles.
How are you? Hey, I'm glad to see you.
Charles, you are not only the director or manager of the National Coalition for Cultural Diversity in Canada, but also of the international association or network of these coalitions. But maybe you can even better explain yourself what you're doing.
What it is. So it's called a Federation of Coalitions. And we have now 43 national coalitions in mostly developing countries. Like 2/3 of these 43 countries are in Latin America, in Africa, Asia Pacific. And then you have 13, 14 in Europe, including Slovakia, Hungary, Sweden, so mostly in Western Europe, but not exclusively. Canada, of course. And this is an association of arts and culture organizations themselves. Coalitions nationally have to intend to be of membership based on Actors Association, Musician Association, producers, directors, and so on. So it's basically we're representing associations that are national, like in Germany the Kulturrat, which is
is part of this.
Is part of the the coalition. That's right.
Okay. But then actually it represents one sort of piece of the cake of what the notion cultural diversity actually means. Because I've learned in my recent work for the Alliance of Civilization, they understand cultural diversity totally different.
Yes.
For them it's different ethnic people or people with a different religion living together more or less harmoniously or having a dialogue or something like that. So that's another understanding.
That's another understanding, yeah. We have to fight this notion that cultural diversity is ethnic diversity or multiculturalism. If you look at the UNESCO 205 convention, it's about the diversity of cultural expressions. And it refers to arts and cultural industries. And so it's the means of expression of these culture through books and music.
But when you say that's a bit a Frenchy interpretation?
No, it's just a way to circumvent, because the field, there was a declaration in 201 which was much broader, and eventually it had to do with issues of trade, it had to do with issues of cultural policy, and it had to do with status of the artist. So obviously this is where the field of this one convention, there could be other on linguistic diversity, or there could be others on ethnic diversity, but this one really focused, and still to this day is looking at expressions.
So the WTO would be sort of the main adversary of this conference?
Well, it was based on the notion that traditionally and up till this UNESCO convention, the only model for cultural development was one of market economy. And and obviously as pressures were mounting and globalization was moving fast, creators and countries were realizing that there was a lot of pressure on their own system and their own expressions. And now what this UNESCO convention is offering is an alternative, one that is based on cooperation and fairer trade of culture between developing and developed economies. So it's basically based on voluntary application. There's, it's not as binding as a World Trade Organization agreement where you have country to country, and even a legal, how do they call this, arbitration court that will, be seized of, disagreements between state parties.
What are the countries party of the convention actually to tell how they implement the convention?
Well, the convention nowadays, you have 187 or maybe 190 UNESCO members. 154 voted for the convention. 2 voted against the United States, Israel, and 4 abstained. Now we're at 120 countries that have ratified, plus the European Union. And we're only missing in Europe, Belgium, which had its own
problems.
Has its own problems. But now it's going to ratify. We've heard that the Flemish national government, or the region, has agreed to ratify. So it's coming for Belgium, and so the whole of Europe. But we have Indonesia being the latest of countries that have ratified, the first Muslim country in the world, non-aligned, 250 million people. They have a new law for audiovisual. They have a quota now for Indonesian cinema. They have Pancasila, which is the constitution that calls for respect for all religion and for diversity. So many, thousands of islands and so many cultures in Indonesia. So this is a country that embraces diversity on its very foundation and recognizes the value of audiovisual as a means to express its identity. So this is one example of such countries that have ratified.
Canada used to be one of the prime examples, actually, of having legislation and measures and programs advocating this type of diversity you are striving for.
Yeah.
I remember quite well at the early days of when cable and satellite television was introduced. Canada was the first one to actually make this a problem of what to see and how to sort of secure some at least minimal standards of national or of cultural content on these channels.
Of course, yes.
How is it still a model?
Oh yes, it's still a very much a debate, and very much so because, I was in France recently, where we're all facing the new challenge of the digital economy, which is both, as we know, an opportunity. Artists are emerging, reaching out audiences and so on, but also a threat to our both regulatory regimes or policy regimes, because it escapes what, we can do as governments or as public administration to control these new mechanisms. But also we're now facing the reality of broadcasting undertakings, television services or cinema or a la carte or VOD moving to these new platforms with obviously American operators. You now have iTunes, or you have the Googles, and now you're going to have tomorrow Facebook and so on, competing for the same dollars, for the same euros, for the same eyeballs, and not bringing back anything to either the creators. There's a copyright issues, but now these things are starting to be settled. But any support whatsoever into the system that creates the very Canadian or European or French or Indonesian content that makes it possible for the diversity to exist.
So from what you're saying, I gather that you are an advocate of the ACTA agreements.
That is a very different subject. That's a very different subject.
You've heard probably that we had even public demonstrations here of thousands of people going to the streets fighting this, and actually made the German government backing and saying, okay, we are not going to ratify that.
Yeah, you're not going to ratify that. Yeah, there's no. I mean, it's one of those areas, one of those gray areas. There's rapid technological development, there's rapid content experiments, there's rapid economic models being tried and tested. There's no clear-cut sort of way to understand how these realities are going to fall. But right now you see a lot of these regulatory agencies or government sort of stepping back and sort of saying, let's see how we are sort of witnessing these evolutions. But there is concern, and that's one area where you have to sort of say, what is the response? If you've ratified this convention, what is your responsibility, and how do you ensure? But I would think that it's not only the audiovisual sector. I think you need to look at the way citizens access and participate in the creation of content. How are they educated to take part in arts and culture? Are there any measures for that? How are they educated to appreciate not only the local forms, but also the best of the international forms that are very, very progressive, very enriching for any culture? You don't want to close the border and say, okay, it's all going to be domestic and prevent your people from accessing some of the best forms of cultural expressions. So it's a very delicate and balanced mix that you cannot just look at from a sectoral point of view, say, because broadcasting plays a very important role, but you have a live performance playing a very important role for communities. I was just in Strasbourg. They tell me that for the local language, that's the theater. Apparently they go in communities, they listen to the local language, they have these huge moments of collective experience with the language and the culture that no other media can replace. I mean, you can't do that in the cinema. This is a cathartic, experience for the community. And it still exists to this day, although they've been taken over by France for now 45 years. Yeah. So obviously it has deep symbolic value to them. So I think it's the range of options.
Maybe the